Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IPA Power Hour webinar on CEJA Turns One, key highlights from the IPA. First, let me introduce myself. I'm Megha Hamal. I'm the Communications Manager for the Illinois Power Agency, and I will be managing the webinar this afternoon. To get started, let's go over some housekeeping items. To reduce any background noise, all participants are muted upon entry. Please feel free to submit any questions in the chat window during the presentation. We will be allocating some time towards the end to answer your questions. Today's session is being recorded, and a copy of this recording will be available on the IPA website under About IPA Events. Couple of points I would like to emphasize before starting this webinar. This webinar is for general education purpose only. After the webinar is completed, we will be sending a feedback survey sometime next week. And this webinar today, we will be providing an overview of IPA's implementation of programmatic and procurement activities around CEJA. Under CEJA, as you all know, CEJA was enacted last year, so there's been a lot of work that has taken place. So we'll be talking about that. We will also be talking about the impact of CEJA on solar programs and key activities on the horizon. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for the session today. Our speakers for the session are Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel, Illinois Power Agency; Audrey Steinbach, Senior Program Manager, Adjustable Block Program; Jennifer Schmidt, Program Manager, Illinois Solar for All; and Sharon Johnson, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager for the Illinois Power Agency. This is a quick agenda. There's a lot to cover, so we're really excited about it. As you all know, IPA Power Hour webinars are just a series of educational webinars that we've offered since last year on a wide range of clean energy topics and emerging issues. Here's a webinar that's taking place on October 28th around energy storage and the role of energy storage as it relates to decarbonization. If you have not registered for the webinar yet, please go ahead and do so. There is a registration link right there. And here's a quick overview on the IPA. We're an independent state agency. We were established in 2007. Our duties include developing and implementing procurement plans for electricity supply for utility customers. Also, we're in charge of developing and implementing renewable portfolio standard and also overseeing solar programs and procurements, renewable procurements. So with that, I would like to introduce or welcome Brian Granahan, Chief Legal Counsel here at the IPA, who will be giving a background on CEJA and how this law came together. Brian.
Thank you, Megha. One of the first things I want to say also is for a lot of these different sections within this webinar, if you aren't familiar with the Power Hour series, in many cases, we've actually done Power Hour sessions on some of these individual sections. Those are available through our website, so you can go back through the archives and find some of the old Power Hours, and that can be very helpful, actually. So one of the things, for instance, I'll be talking about is the IPA's approach to utility scale wind and solar procurements under CEJA. There's an hour-long webinar on that. We have some discussion later about consumer protection. We have an hour-long webinar on that. So those are all available and can, in some cases, provide you with a more in-depth overview. So I think the best way to kick things off is with some background on the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, and specifically how we ended up in the place that we ended up at in September of 2021. So as we go to the next slide. So there are a number of different ingredients that came together to provide the right formula to pull a bill together. One of them was the need to support at-risk nuclear plants. There were some worries that Illinois is one of the most nuclear heavy states in the country. We have 6 plants, 11 reactors, and there was some worry that at least 3 or 4 of them might close. 3 of them ended up being supported through the bill. A really strong desire for more equitable outcomes in the clean energy economy, need for additional funding for our state's renewable portfolio standard, a lot of concern around ethics in the utility space and need for rate making reform and maybe moving away from something a little bit different than formula rates. and then also coal plant closures and communities in transition. You have all of these different interests that then showed up in a number of different bills with a lot of different solutions on the table across about 2019 and 2020. So we go to the next slide. So from the RPS standpoint, we had real successes under CEJA in terms of incenting the development of a large number of projects. Under the Future Energy Jobs Act, or FEJA, which passed in December of 2016, took effect June 1st, 2017, and then we had implementation activities really occurring across 2018 and 2019, resulting in project development across 2019, 2020, and 2021. We facilitated the development of thousands of megawatts of new wind and solar projects. In particular, the distributed generation space, so your rooftop solar projects. We're talking about over 20,000 systems being supported that allowed a lot of new Illinois residents that hadn't before to participate in the clean energy economy. So there's a lot of success there on that quantitative basis. But when you look at this through the lens of what had been a 25% by 2025 RPS, where we're seeking to receive 25% of our electricity from renewables by the year 2025, we were still well behind those percentage-based targets, only at about 7 or 8%, even with all of these new projects. And all the while, there were funding limitations. The overall RPS budget was about $230 million per year. Given the way that the funding couldn't be rolled over from year to year after a certain point in time, and given the way that contract payouts worked under direct delivery contracts, we were running into real funding constraints to continue to scale that up in a way that the law called for through these percentage-based targets. So there was a real sense that we need to do something a little bit grander, a little bit larger scale in order to meet targets that aggressive. At the same time, there's a real sense that maybe the benefits of the clean energy economy weren't being shared equitably across our state, or the workforce that participated in that economy wasn't as equitable as it could be. And that informed a lot of the changes that we saw in legislative proposals around the state's RPS. So as we go to the next slide. So across 2019 and 2021, there were a number of different individual bills introduced that addressed these sorts of concerns and other concerns. This is just an exemplary listing of them. I'm sure there are actually more beyond this, and in particular, this is a snapshot from a point in time, I believe. So there might have been variations of this bill or different bills altogether introduced at earlier points in the process. But it gives you some sense of how you had all these different interests who had different legislative proposals, and all of this needed to be brought together and brought into something that could serve as an omnibus energy reform bill. And there was a lot of negotiation across 2020 and 2021 to try to do just that. So as we go to the next slide, it's about a two and a half year process, maybe even longer, from these bills or even the concepts being brought together as part of an actual bill that could then be signed into law. There were workshops, working groups, committee hearings, different drafts being exchanged, comment processes. And then, you can't talk about this period of time without talking about the fact that there was also a global health pandemic that caused the Illinois General Assembly to stop meeting in March of 2020. It really froze a lot of the ongoing discussions around trying to pass a bill. So certainly the pandemic may have changed the timeline associated with getting a bill passed. It certainly changed the timeline of the activities that were necessary to get a bill passed. But this all did start to coalesce around late May of 2021 as that year's legislative session drew to a close, and we started seeing drafts that were put together, I believe primarily by Senate Energy Committee staff, of all of these different elements being put together into kind of like a larger omnibus bill. And then that continued to be negotiated over the summer, and the pieces came together as the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. We was voted out of one chamber on September 9th, out of another on September 13th, and then signed into law on September 15th, 2021. That bill really represents a number of different parties' visions across all different types of constituencies, and it's put together in a heavily negotiated bill. I think it's about 960 pages. Touches on a huge number of areas. For purposes of this discussion and what's happened since, we're mostly just focused on what the IPA has been doing. So there's a ton that the ICC has been doing, there's a ton that DCO has been doing, a lot that IEPA has been doing, and probably a number of other state agencies. But for our purposes, this webinar is just about what has the IPA been doing over the last year since CEJA passed, what can we look at as progress, and where do things go from here? So let's go to the next slide. So one of the big changes with CEJA is changes to the state's RPS. And I think this is very important for the IPA because so much of what we do is driven by the state's renewable portfolio standard, where we're trying to facilitate the development of new solar and wind projects in Illinois. And the change from a percentage basis was from 25% by 2020, I'm sorry, by 2025 to 40% by 2030 and 50% by 2040. So that's a really, really big change, and more aggressive targets that carried with it also more funding. To get there, you would need about 30 million RECs for 25% of all retail sales. To get to 40%, it's about 48 million RECs. And then if you look at this lower part of the slide, you can see how that's broken down as between wind and solar projects. So 45% of those RECs are from wind, 55% from solar. And then within solar, you have an additional breakdown of projects from the adjustable block program, which is distributed generation, such as rooftop solar and community solar projects. Then you have utility scale projects, and then you have 3% from brownfield site solar projects. In sum, you're looking at a state's RPS that, according to these targets, is made up of about 3/4 utility scale projects. Those are your projects above 5 megawatts in size, generally located in more agrarian areas where you can build projects to scale. That accounts for about 75% of the total energy output under the state's RPS, with about 25% then remaining for your rooftop projects and your community solar projects. So as we go to the next slide. With this also came massive changes in funding. So going from about $235 million a year to $590 million a year in the RPS budget. And then now we have about $50 million a year of utility collections supporting the Illinois Solar for All program. And Jen Schmidt, our Illinois Solar for All program manager, will get into some of the changes on that over time. There were also changes to how those funds were accounted for that were very important at the time, making sure that they could be rolled over year to year to give us more flexibility in how they were spent. That's going to prove to be very beneficial to us in trying to basically manage RPS budgets against project development cycles when we can't always control project development cycles, and projects by and large, outside of a few exceptions, are not receiving payment until energization. So this is some big picture changes through CEJA of how the IPA manages its RPS work. So as we go forward to the next slide, there's also a number of things that were provided for about how our planning changed as well. So all of the different programs and procurements and new requirements are folded into what's called our long-term renewable resources procurement plan. That's a document that we first published in 2017. The first version of it was approved by the Illinois Commerce Commission in 2018. CEJA had us publish a new version of that document within 120 days of its passage. So that document was published in January of 2022 and filed with the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval in March of 2022. Now, parties are given the opportunity to provide comments before that document is submitted before the Illinois Commerce Commission. We had comments from over 40 parties, and then a number of other parties that intervened in the actual litigation for the commission. That plan was approved just recently in July of 2022, and then we filed a final plan consistent with the ICC's order approving it in August. So these are things that happened just recently that gives us really the groundwork for all of what's to come, both in terms of program changes, in terms of competitive procurement changes, in terms of DEI initiatives, in terms of consumer protection. All of those different things are addressed in the plan. And I do have to say that it's a huge team effort here at the IPA when it comes to putting that plan together. We had individual teams for individual chapters of the plan. A lot of that content was developed by different staff members. And it was, I think, a great example of how we can all work together and really bring our agency up to scale in accomplishing something like this. The plan, if you've never seen one of these before, it's about 350 pages, 360 pages long. So it's a pretty extensive document with some very technical analysis. So it takes a while to pull it all together, but it also takes a lot of work on behalf of our team members to do so. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to talk specifically about one of the items addressed through that plan, primarily through Chapter 5 of that plan, and that is our utility scale and brownfield site photovoltaic procurements under CEJA. Now, as I mentioned previously, this constitutes probably the bulk of the RPS. About 70 to 75% of all RECs that are used to meet the RPS are from utility scale projects. So if you look at this in an overall number of new megawatts installed basis, it corresponds roughly with that amount, although it's a little bit different depending on the capacity factor of projects. But the big takeaway is that most of the RPS is going to be met through the largest scale projects where we can achieve the highest level economies of scale. So going to the next slide, pre-CEJA, so this is prior to 2017, there was some work done through IPA procurements to facilitate the development of new projects, primarily new wind farms. But back then you had a state RPS that was really only able to provide financial support for those projects development through funds collected from default supply customers. And as we're a restructured state, you have customer migration from competitive supply service over to default supply service. And you don't necessarily have a stable balance of funds that you can use to support additional contracts. So we really only had one event, the 2010 long-term power purchase agreements, as they're called, where we had a large-scale procurement event that would support the development of new renewable projects in Illinois. And that resulted in a large number of wind farms across our state. Only, I think, one solar project was supported through that procurement. So you didn't have a whole lot going on prior to the Future Energy Jobs Act. Post Future Energy Jobs Act, you had utility scale projects supported through competitive procurement events where bids were selected on the basis of fixed price per rec bids. So you had overall procurement quantities that were published, however many millions of recs, for instance, from either utility scale wind or utility scale solar or brownfield site solar. And then for qualifying projects, you were choosing those bids on the basis of their price, with the lowest price projects being selected up to a given procurement quantity. We were able to support the development of a number of projects through that approach. Different procurement events are listed here. About 2,600 megawatts total selected for rec delivery contracts through that process, and with the vast majority of those projects being located in Illinois, only one wasn't. If you're interested more about how adjacent state projects may qualify for the Illinois RPS, that's addressed through Chapter 4 of our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. It was not changed significantly through CEJA, so it looks much as it did about 5 years ago. So we had some success in supporting the development of large-scale wind and solar projects through FEJA, but there were definitely tweaks that needed to be made to that structure. So going to the next slide. So the key changes through the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act is obviously, number one, a big scaling up in the overall RPS budget that allows us to support the development of far more projects than we were able to previously. And then a change in the minimum size that would apply to what's considered a utility scale project from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. The reality is that we don't tend to get a lot of projects that are proposed participating at those sizes. The minimum size is generally going to feature the least economies of scale. So you tend to see larger scale projects able to bid more competitively in events like this. Now, the big change to the structure that we use to select utility scale projects in our competitive procurement events and support those projects' development was a move toward an index rec price model. And the way that this model works is that as wholesale energy prices go up, rec prices go down. So bidder bids in a kind of an all-in strike price that includes both the energy price and the rec price, and that rec price floats over time based on wholesale market conditions. That should allow more energy or more revenue certainty back to renewable project developers, because they know that even if prices bottom out for energy prices, then the rec price will make that up. Vice versa is true. They have revenue certainty when it comes to the revenue from their projects, even if the actual state administered support is only the rec portion of that contract. That does create some long-term challenges with planning the budget impacts on the RPS budget, because you don't know what those rec prices are going to be year over year. We're to produce a forward price curve to try to estimate where we think energy prices are going, which then tells us where we think those rec prices are going to be. But it is the case that this model and the change to this model was something that utility scale project developers really sought in the years leading up to CEJA's passage and got through CEJA's passage. And we're hoping that going forward, that provides a better model for them when it comes to state administered support for new large scale wind and solar projects. So going to the next slide. So also some other changes are weaving in changes to project selection criteria, specifically providing preferences for projects in energy transition community grant areas. This is something still under development as DCEO is working to define where those areas are. And then workforce diversity progress and us introducing selection criteria that gives credit back for utilization of EECs when it comes to how we judge the price of bids. So a bid that might utilize more equity eligible contractors will be viewed more favorably than one that did less on a price basis. That's all outlined in our long-term plan that was approved by the ICC in July. There's also new labor requirements that apply to these projects. Prevailing wage is expressly required, and the project labor agreements are also required for any projects that receive this sort of state administered support. It's also moved toward a large customer self-direct program. We'll get into that a little bit in the last slide that we have. That was put forth in our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. That's something that will get off the ground to support projects like this, say in 2023, but it allows customers who contract separately with new utility scale wind and solar projects above a certain size and contracts of a sufficient term to then receive a discount on their RPS bill. There were also definitions in the changes in the definition of the brownfield site, where coal mine sites are now included. Fairly minor change, but something that expands the definition of what might be considered a brownfield site, allowing for solar projects at those sites to participate in our brownfield site procurement events. So going to the next slide and how all of this is played out. We had targeted for a procurement that we conducted before our long-term plan was passed, the following RECs being delivered annually under contract, so 2.5 million RECs from wind, 2 million RECs from solar, 125,000 RECs from brownfield site projects. If you kind of look at it, the rule of thumb that I always have in converting those REC quantities, annual REC deliveries to megawatts, is maybe 350 megawatts of wind for 1 million RECs, given the capacity factor of wind. Maybe about 650 megawatts of solar for 1 million RECs from solar. So that's about 1,300 megawatts of solar that we saw, utility scale solar that we saw. And I guess about 700, a little more than 700, more like 800 megawatts of utility scale wind. We ended up in our first procurement event at something that was well short of that, about 495 megawatts of utility scale solar, 200 megawatts of utility scale wind projects, and then a very small amount of brownfield site projects. Linked a link there that has the procurement results themselves, but holding stakeholder comment processes since. And as we go to the next slide. So our schedule is to conduct a number of additional procurement events after that first procurement event. The quantities are listed in the right-hand tables. We have another one of these coming up where I believe the bid date is in early December of 2022, then another one in September, so the summer of 2023. And then as the quote at the bottom indicates, if we haven't filled procurement quantities, we can propose an additional procurement event. So we've conducted one utility scale procurement since CEJA's passage before the approval of our long-term plan. We got results that weren't as high as we ultimately had targeted. We have additional ones coming up that give us the chance to make changes. We have documents out for stakeholder comment now to try to improve those procurement events and attract more participation, and ultimately get ourselves in a trajectory where we're meeting those ambitious RPS targets through utility scale project development. So there's a lot more to come on this in the next year with these additional procurement events, but we've also got a good chunk of projects that have already been supported through the state's RPS. So let's go to the next slide. So with that, I will turn things over to Audrey Steinbach. She will talk about the Adjustable Block Program and the changes to the Adjustable Block Program under the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act.
Thanks so much, Brian. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to kind of breeze through this with the caveat that a lot of the information I'm going to be talking about can be found in more detail on the Adjustable Block Program website. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So a few of the major big changes that we saw to the Adjustable Block Program under CEJA are outlined here. The first one, change in project sizes. So the breakpoint between small and large DG projects was increased. It used to be 10 kilowatts and it was increased to 25 kilowatts. Additionally, the size threshold for those bigger projects, large DG and community solar projects, increased from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts. We saw 3 new project categories introduced into the program, one focused on public schools, one focused on community-driven community solar projects, and one focused on projects developed by equity-eligible contractors. We also saw updated REC prices, new prevailing wage requirements for all projects submitted to the Adjustable Block Program, updated REC delivery contracts to go with those new REC prices and all of these changes under CEJA, and then the Equity Accountability System, which we are providing more informational webinars through the program on coming up next week and the coming months that will begin next summer in 2023. And we also saw a shift from cascading adjustable blocks to annual blocks of capacity that open the start of each delivery year on June 1st of each year, aside from this year. And then we also see a shift in this concept of reallocation of uncontracted capacity from a previous program year and having kind of a rollover of that capacity into the next program year. Next slide, please. So what have we implemented so far? So we've updated a few requirements related to prevailing wage when the program reopened in December of 2021 after the law passed. We also immediately implemented the new size of those projects, as I mentioned, with the small DG and large DG breakpoint and the cap from 2 megawatts to 5 megawatts for those larger projects. We also have already implemented the capacity reallocation, which is why the opening blocks that we opened on September 1st had a little bit marginal megawatts added into those from last program year. We also have a ton of new documentation that provides all of these new requirements in an outlined way. So we have, of course, what Brian mentioned at length, the 2022 long-term plan has been updated. And from that, we had an update to the adjustable block programs program guidebook, as well as a new consumer protection handbook that converts the old marketing guidelines into a singular document and covers both the adjustable block program and the Illinois Solar for All program. We also have new contract requirements for both community solar and distributed generation and got those new contracts in place. We have also already implemented the new program timing. So right after the law passed, we had a program year that lasted from December 14th, 2021 until September 1st. So we just opened new blocks of capacity on September 1st because we had the law pass and then the long-term plan get finalized. So we had kind of a stutter step year here on the date of program opening, but moving forward, we will be opening the program on June 1st each year in that shift to those annual blocks. Next slide, please. CEJA's impact on the program. So as I mentioned, the timing of the program has been a little bit funky in the past year. The law passed, we reopened the program in compliance with the law on December 14th, 2021, with a ton of updates that are listed here. And that was one program year. And then we just opened for another program year, the 2022-23 program year on September 1st for all categories except for traditional community solar, which will come on November 1st. And we did allocate that uncontracted capacity from the previous program year into those block capacity allocations that were released on September 1st. Next slide, please. So not only do we see a change in requirements under CEJA for the adjustable block program, but we also really see a true shift in focus on the program. So with these three new program categories that were added into the program by the law, we see a real push forward to incentivize specific types of projects that are being developed through the program. So again, those are projects being cited on public schools. Those are community-driven community solar projects that have specific requirements that really work to engage community members in ownership and development of community solar. And we also see the equity eligible contractor program category that allows a set aside amount of capacity for contractors that fall under this definition and get certified as such to be able to pull from that capacity. We also see a huge shift to focus on equity. So we see the introduction of the equity accountability system, which is just getting up to speed, and we'll see get implemented starting next summer, as well as new prevailing wage requirements for all projects. Again, the equity eligible contractor block. And then finally, a training and mentorship program that we're just starting getting moving here for minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, veteran-owned businesses, disability-owned businesses, and small businesses. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a couple times previously, we have reallocated previously unused capacity from last program year into the blocks for this program year that just opened on September 1st. So you'll see these amended block capacity allocations with these decimal points. These are the result of that reallocation process. Again, more detail on that is located both in the program guidebook and through an announcement on the Adjustable Block Program website. But this is what this year's capacity was starting out as. Next slide, please. So what's next for the program? The future of the program, we're going to see, again, new traditional community solar project applications being available on November 1st. We saw all other blocks open on September 1st. And then after this, we're going to see the program open each year on June 1st at the start of that delivery year. So that's going to be a dependable date that the market can always rely on. We'll also see the implementation of the equity accountability system with the submission of minimum equity standard compliance plans by approved vendors and their designees. And we'll also continue to hold educational webinars on that equity accountability system and these new program categories to orient the market to all of these changes, new requirements, and kind of a lot of newness that is still setting in from CEJA. We'll continue to have stakeholder feedback sessions on these programmatic changes and getting feedback from program participants on what's working, what isn't. And then finally, that training and mentorship program for minority approved vendors that I mentioned previously as well. Next slide, please. This is the planned delivery year capacity for next program year. Again, you'll see the kind of caveat at the bottom of the slide there. This does not include the reallocated capacity that we will see from this program year of 2022-2023. So these numbers will shift a little bit once that capacity is rolled over. Next slide, please. Thanks so much. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jen Schmidt, so she can talk about Illinois Solar for All.
Thanks, Audrey. My name is Jennifer Schmidt. I'm the Illinois Solar for All Program Manager. And next slide. And next. So like Audrey mentioned, with ABP and the changes of focus, there are a number of focus changes in Illinois Solar for All that came under CEJA as well. First of those big changes were a change in the sub-programs. So the previous residential solar sub-program that covered all sizes of residential distributed generation projects, that was split into two separate sub-programs, one for small residential solar, which is covering 1 to 4 units residential projects, and 5+ unit residential solar projects. CEJA also ended the low-income community solar pilot procurement. So that money was freed up to go into other projects. And then this is not part of CEJA, but in response to CEJA's update of the names, and we were just looking at how we can improve the program, we updated the sub-program names to be a little bit more participant friendly. The term low income is used a lot, and we're trying to move away from that term and replace that with income eligible. So you might be seeing that in our materials, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that. Funding changes. So the utility contributions for the Illinois Solar for All program grew from, previously they were about 11 million a year, and now they will be 50 million a year going forward. And then CEJA also changed the split of how those funds are applied to the various sub-programs. So I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then our focus changes, you can kind of categorize those as broadening the participation, particularly in the small residential sub-program. CEJA gave us a directive to incorporate energy sovereignty into Illinois Solar for All projects. And then it also directed us to continue working to coordinate with other programs that are also serving the same households that we're trying to reach with Illinois Solar for All. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, the low-income solar community solar pilot projects was eliminated. And then it also split the low-income distributed generation sub-program into two separate sub-programs. Single family and small multifamily solar. So this is the 1 to 4 unit projects that I was talking about. And then low income large multifamily solar, which is serving 5+ unit households. Despite being two separate sub-programs, CEJA did provide one allocation for the two sub-programs. So the way we're handling that is the first 9 months of the program, the funding allocation will be separate, and there's a separate allocation for both. And then after 9 months, whatever funds are left in each one will be combined and available for both kinds of projects. And then on the bottom half, we have a table showing the changes in our sub-program names. You can see the first two are previously the low-income single-family and small multifamily solar and the large multifamily solar. Those are now our residential solar sub-programs. And then we also have the community solar sub-program and the nonprofit and public facilities sub-program. Next slide. Just 1 second back to that. You may see those name changes come up as we are updating our materials for PY5. I think I just heard that our website is being gone through and we're getting those names updated on the website and updating all of our materials for this change. Okay, next slide. As I mentioned earlier, CEJA did increase the funding available for Illinois Solar for All. Solar for All is funded through the Renewable Energies Resources Fund and through utility funding. The utility contributions through CEJA grew from 11 million to 50 million a year. So that provides us a lot more funding to have projects that serve low-income household or income-eligible households, nonprofits, and public facilities. Now, as I also mentioned, CEJA changed the split of funding allocation for Illinois Solar for All. So a lot of the funds that were freed up from the community solar pilot procurement are now in the residential sub-program. And then we also have a larger allocation now for community solar, and then our nonprofit and public facilities also got some additional funding. Next slide. So we were able to take advantage of the additional funding that CEJA approved with the previous program year. So that was PY22. We had already done our initial project selection when CEJA was approved. So the top line of our 2021-22 original allocation shows the funding that was available originally for PY22, and then the second line is the amended funding that was approved through CEJA. Next slide, we can see what we did with that. So I think I may have, so the second line is the actual number of projects and the capacity that was approved under CEJA. And so you can see that especially with the nonprofit and public facilities and the community solar sub-programs, those always have more submissions than we had funds available for. So we had wait lists for both the community solar sub-program and nonprofit and public facilities. And when the additional funding from CEJA was available, we were able to apply that funding to our wait lists from the beginning of the program year. So we had for the program year, we were able to, as you can see, expand the nonprofit and public facilities and community solar sub-programs greatly. The residential solar programs have not had enough as much development in them, and so we have been expanding. And so you can see from 2020, from the 2021 program year to the 2022 program year, we were able to increase significantly in our projects. And so we're hoping to increase that in some more with some initiatives that CEJA is prompting. And so I'll be talking about those in our next slides. We can go to our next one. So with the focus change of broadening Illinois Solar for All participation, I don't want to read quotes to you because you all can read, and I know we're short on time. But we did, the CEJA is directing us to make sure that we are doing a good job of getting Illinois Solar for All over the state. And so we have a few initiatives that we're going to be targeting development around the state. And then we're also providing additional support for small and emerging businesses. And so we're working on ways that we can support that and remove barriers from small and emerging solar developers so that they can participate in Illinois Solar for All and take advantage of the incentives that it provides. And then just as a sideline for the small and emerging businesses, we are going to be tracking the progress for that and reporting it at least once a year. Next slide. To promote development in the residential solar program for small developments for 1 to 4 unit projects, we have 2 pilots that we're going to be implementing starting later this year. The residential solar program delivery pilot. And with this, our program administrator is going to take on the majority of the customer interaction and outreach for the small solar projects. And then we're also going to be especially trying to work with small and emerging businesses as we are developing those projects. This is going to streamline the application and development process and seek to ease soft costs and related to customer acquisition. And then our second pilot is a pilot that will provide additional incentives to provide the home repairs and upgrades that are necessary on many homes that have deferred maintenance that prevents them from taking advantage of solar. And that's in response to seeing 2 things that we've heard all along about deferred maintenance being a problem and a barrier for Illinois Solar for All participation in residential solar. Next slide, please. And CEJA also introduced energy sovereignty for Illinois Solar for All. We determined that a 25% carve out of each subprogram, and this is part of the plan that sets the 25% carve out. And we're going to be promoting projects that have local control and ownership of the participants. For the residential solar programs and the nonprofit and public facility subprogram, we're going to be offering a $10 per rec adder. And then for community solar projects, it is a it's prioritization points to make the project more likely to be selected in a competitive subprogram. Next slide. And then CEJA also instructs us to keep trying to coordinate with other programs, which we've done all along, but we are, it gives us a few more programs to cooperate with. So CEJA created several new programs that we are hopeful that are going to help support Illinois Solar for All development. And I think most of these are not developed yet, but we are going to be keeping our eye on them and seeing how we can work with those projects to promote Illinois Solar for All and make it easier for participants to take advantage of all of the incentives that they have available. Next slide. And then CEJA also gave us a little bit more flexibility of how we can use our grassroots education funding. They gave us a little bit more flexibility to include other activities deemed to be qualified by the agency. And that goes beyond our traditional our campaigns that the grassroots educators are currently doing. We are bringing on board our new set of grassroots educators. So we will have the traditional grassroots education campaigns that we've done in the past that will be continuing. And we're going to look how we can supplement that with other activities that's promoting Illinois Solar for All at the community level. And then finally, CEJA also, we're creating actually this is not from CEJA, this is from the 2022 plan. We are creating an Illinois Solar for All advisory group that will help advise the IPA on how we can improve the Illinois Solar for All program. We're going to meet regularly, and we hope that this group will have representatives of Illinois Solar for All stakeholders of all kinds, consumer advocates, utilities, and so on, and approved vendors, and so on. And we hope that we'll have robust participation in this group and and it can help inform how we can improve Illinois Solar for All going forward. Next slide. And with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Sharon Johnson.
Thank you, Jen. Today I'll speak about a few of the CEJA implementations we're working on and what's been done so far for DEI requirements. Next slide. So DEI requirements under CEJA, the equity accountability system is a major requirement under CEJA for the agency to administer, basically to ensure participants in our program and procurements are making and achieving their commitments to utilize a more diverse set of contractors and workers. June 1st, 2023 is the target date for the beginning of the delivery year. Two main attributes to highlight about this system are the minimum equity standards and the energy workforce equity database. The agency will stand up later this year to serve as a bridge between equity eligible contractors and equity eligible persons in the first phase. Another DEI requirement under CEJA will be the racial disparity study to provide review and analysis of the state's renewable energy sector for access and participation of contractors with a special emphasis on small and disadvantaged businesses and workers. And lastly, the IPA will implement outreach to small and disadvantaged businesses to make our efforts more robust. Next slide. The equity accountability system is designed basically to advance equity across the state by providing access to clean energy economy for businesses and workers. But in addition to that, the minimum equity standards for compliance and a few other features the system will be comprised of are the equity eligible contractor category we spoke about earlier for the adjustable block program. And this is CEJA creating a new category in ABP reserved for applications from the equity eligible contractors. Projects from EECs will also have the option for advancement of capital after their REC contract is signed and finalized to address barriers to access for capital. Another feature would be the compliance plans, submittal, review, and reporting process, and enforcement. Next slide. The equity portal or database, the agency is setting up a publicly accessible database for EECs and EEPs and other program participants to connect with suppliers, vendors, and subcontractors. So this database will feature some items such as the job postings and recruiting opportunities, information on workforce training, service providers, and training opportunities. Phase 1 will roll out later this year, and remaining requirements will roll out in 2023 to incorporate additional details from the Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity as these details become available. Next slide. The racial disparity study, as I mentioned earlier, will analyze the presence and the impact of racial discrimination throughout the state for renewable energy sector, with a special emphasis on minority businesses and workers. And the study will also furnish recommendations on how to adjust the equity accountability system to remedy any discrimination that's discovered. Next slide. Small and disadvantaged business outreach. This will be implemented to improve participation and involvement for disadvantaged businesses and people. The IPA is prioritizing outreach to enhance our efforts to expand access to renewable energy programs, especially for communities that have been systematically and historically excluded from economic opportunities. Stakeholder input is key to achieving this effort, And we plan to use feedback to implement strategic planning for portions of our outreach vision. Next slide. So what has been implemented so far? The minimum equity standards will be applicable to utility scale procurements. We have a few approved elements through the implementation of our long-term plan. This includes things like the equity eligible persons having an option to self-identify as qualified individuals for installing clean energy, the definition of workforce or project workforce subject was clarified and expanded regarding the minimum equity standard requirements, to name a couple. Equity eligible contractor expansion. Some of the metrics around that include 10 registered EECs and 5 more applications under review, and this is growing. Another effort would be to include EEC utilization in community solar project selection, scoring, and our outreach activities. Next slide. What's on the horizon? Well, we have a few items that are on the horizon. We have ongoing activities to our database or portal, as I mentioned earlier, which include a selection of a viable platform to meet the needs of connecting EECs and EEPs to access workforce training opportunities and to connect with suppliers, vendors, and subcontractors. We also have continued outreach to businesses to expand development of strategy and stakeholder input. Some of the events that have already been done and a few that are upcoming are, we had a panel discussion earlier this year on energy equity. More recently, we attended the ComEd Solar Forum to raise awareness around solar energy programs. And upcoming next month, there'll be a town hall discussion with the Chicago Urban League and Inverness to discuss job training programs and contract opportunities for Black and Brown contractors. And in addition to our outreach to prioritize communities, businesses, and people who have been excluded from these opportunities, we further plan to expand the DEI team at IPA to include 2 newly created positions, the outreach associate and the data analyst. So we're excited about that. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mega for additional announcements and questions.
Yeah, Brian, I think it's you now. Thanks, Sharon.
Yeah, we have one more slide just on some additional activities. So as we go to the next slide, and I would say that this slide could be a full hour-long presentation in and of itself, but that would actually be selling it short, because some of these items individually have already been hour-long presentations through prior power hours. But I did want to run through these because they're very important. They've taken up a lot of staff time or resources, and they're very important to the outside market. The first of these is the implementation of the carbon mitigation credit plan and procurement. So carbon mitigation credit, this mechanism is used to support at-risk nuclear plants. And we published, so CEJA was signed into law September 15th. We published our draft carbon mitigation credit procurement plan on September 17th, filed at the ICC in late September. All of that happened very quickly after CEJA's passage. It was really a real team effort with our procurement planning consultant, Levitan & Associates, our procurement administrator, Near Economic Consulting, such that we had all of that wrapped up with carbon mitigation credit delivery contracts in place and a plan approved by the ICC by early December of 2021. So that was about a 3-month process quickly after CEJA's passage to make sure that we had a mechanism in place to support at-risk nuclear plants. Now, the way that mechanism works is very similar to what I mentioned previously around index rec contracts, in that as wholesale energy prices go up, credit prices go down and vice versa. We've seen rises in wholesale energy prices over the last 1.5 years, really. As a consequence of that, those prices have gone negative in a way such that ComEd customers are scheduled to save potentially $2 to $3 billion during the 2022-2023 delivery year because of the negative value of carbon mitigation credits. So that policy that's in place to ensure revenue certainty for these nuclear plants at times when wholesale energy prices are high is actually providing a very substantial credit back to ComEd customers. If you're a ComEd customer, you can take a look at your bill and you can see the charges associated with that, or the credits back associated with that. So that took up a lot of staff time and is certainly very important more broadly to energy policy in Illinois. Another item, and this came up a bit during some of the individual discussions, is prevailing wage and project labor agreements and enforcing those requirements through our programs and procurements. That's been really new for us, and we've got a great partnership with the Illinois Department of Labor in understanding the lay of the land there and also understanding what their capacity is. So that's been an area where we did not have any standing expertise. Thankfully, our counsel, Sarah Duffy, who came to the agency about a year ago, she got up to speed very quickly on these requirements and has served as our in-house expert throughout the development of materials related to these requirements. Additional consumer protection work, I also want to highlight another staff member, Rachel Graneman, who came on board in January, who's really heading up this work now. We had a strong focus on consumer protection before, dating back to the initial long-term plan, but that's only increased since. As Audrey mentioned in her presentation, we have now a consumer protection handbook that's kind of a standalone document that has all different requirements associated with it. We still have some work to do as we've changed the adjustable block program over to a new program administrator. So we're still standing up a lot of different materials. But we heard CEJA's call loud and clear to make sure that we had a strong focus on consumer protection, and I think we're following through on that. The self-direct program, this was all just litigated through our long-term plan process. And right now we're in the process of working with our procurement planning consultant, Levitan and Associates, on analyzing the market size or what the size of the program could be. And I believe we're scheduled to publish an initial draft of that sometime toward the end of this calendar year. And then early in 2023, we start looking at things like application forms and estimating the actual crediting rate. And that results in a filing with the ICC of what that crediting rate is under the self-direct program in the spring of 2023, with the program then taking effect June 1st, 2023 for that delivery year and providing credits back to participating customers in that delivery year. So there's a lot more to come on that, but probably not going to be in a position for about another 4 to 6 weeks to talk externally to entities that are interested in participating about where that stands and where things go from here. Coal to solar was another big part of the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act. Through the coal to solar policy, we are supporting the development of solar plus storage at different coal plant sites through fixed price REC delivery contracts of 15 or 20 years in length. These are $30 per REC contracts. We had one procurement event back in April of 2022 to support the development of solar and storage at select coal plant sites, and another one scheduled for October of 2022. So that's been moving along as well. A few other items that I tossed in here as well, because I wanted to highlight some of the great work the ICC has been doing, and the IPA has provided some limited feedback on this. The development of their storage plan. We have a role in law and consulting with the ICC on that. So that contains a number of different policy proposals for what we can do on storage. And as Megan mentioned previously, that's going to be the topic of our next Power Hour. There's not a lot that the IPA does presently with respect to storage, but we see what's on the horizon, and we want to at least provide a forum for discussing what might be coming up next. And then also consultation with the ICC regarding its Renewable Energy Access Plan. There's a bit of a meshing that needs to occur where regional transmission organizations and others involved in the management of regional grids need to know more about what state level goals are when it comes to renewable energy development, because that can help inform then their transmission planning activities. And the Renewable Energy Access Plan is one such route that's available, and the ICC is the one that's putting that together. We've started meeting regularly with the ICC and their staff members on some issues related to RTO issues, federal issues, and also the development of this access plan to make sure that there's an ongoing dialogue between our agencies given our overlapping jurisdiction. So those are just some additional items that from the IPA standpoint, we've got in motion or have made some work on, some progress on in the last year since CEJA's passage. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mega for any questions, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Brian. I'm looking at the chat window right now. Looks like we may have one question. As you noted in 2021, this is from Chris, only about 8% of the energy consumed was from renewable energy. Illinois had a goal of procuring 19% of the energy consumed from renewable energy, but the goal was 19%. Where is Illinois at right now in trying to meet the state's RPS goals?
Sure. I think the first place you'd probably want to look there is Chapter 3 of our long-term renewable resource procurement plan. That gives you firm numbers on projects under contract, the RECs that we expect to be delivered from those projects. In simple math terms, you can add the utility scale projects that were added to what we had under contract through those activities that I outlined, the progress that we've made through the Adjustable Block Program, the Solar for All program, and then you would end up with something where you can sort of see the additional trajectory. What we have right now in place are procurement quantities that we're seeking through the different programs and competitive procurements that we run that should get us to those numbers in time. So in other words, we're establishing annual quantities that are based on what we need in a step-laddered approach to get there. So we're not that much further along now than we were before, but we're starting to conduct activities that get us on a track to make sure that we're meeting 2030 and 2040 targets.
Great, thank you, Brian. So there was one other question on energy storage registration. We've provided that in the chat window, and you can also find that information on our website. One last question, I guess we can take this one. For the ABP, has the EEC block already opened?
Yes, I can answer that. The EEC block has already opened for DG projects, but for those projects that would be community solar, the community solar applications are not available until November 1st.
And we also had, I believe, Audrey, a reopening in December. We did open the EEC blocks. We went from 3 categories to 6, and we did open blocks for each of those 6 categories, correct?
Yes, that's correct. More information about the different blocks that are open at the moment and the capacity of those blocks can be found on the Adjustable Block Program website, where we have a capacity dashboard that has a table there. So I can drop that link in the chat in just a second.
Great, thank you, Audrey. There is a question from John Delury. Thanks, John. Is there any way to incorporate merchant solar numbers that don't participate in REC programs into the RPS? Does the self-direct program allow accounting for those megawatts into the RPS percentage?
Yes and yes. So if I had a longer last slide, one of the things that I would have included is changes under CEJA to our annual report. So the IPA publishes an annual report each year, I think in mid-February or so, that's independent of our long-term plan. And one of the things that is new through CEJA as part of the annual report is trying to figure out the universe of merchant utility scale wind and solar projects in Illinois. Those projects have no obligation to report anything to us, so we have to go out and find this information. But we do recognize that a number of projects are being developed completely independent of the IPA's programs. It may not even be participating in the self-direct program, may not have customers participating in the self-direct program, so we don't have a way to account for those in the RPS. What we proposed is through the annual plan to basically have at least the math available to everyone. So when we talk about the amount of renewable generation in Illinois, we're not just relying on the RPS number. That's just about RECs under a contract in the RPS. And then with respect to the self-direct program, it is correct that RECs ultimately that are being procured by those customers from qualifying projects, you would then back out those customers from the denominator essentially that you're using to calculate the RPS. As a consequence, what you're doing is essentially saying, yeah, all of these RECs are basically counting toward at least reducing the RPS obligations that we have. But those RECs are being received and retired by those customers and not by Illinois electric utilities. So they're accounting them from them under the RPS. It's a slightly different definition than we would have for projects that are actually being supported through the RPS.
Thanks, Brian. I think those are the questions that we received. Again, it was a lot of information, but we have provided contact information of our presenters in this presentation. So if you have any additional questions, please feel free to reach out to our presenters. On behalf of the IPA, we want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. We hope it was educational. We also want to thank our presenters for presenting an insightful webinar and the discussion around some of the topics that we have implemented since CEJA was enacted last year. With that, we would like to conclude this Power Hour. We hope to see you all on our next Power Hour on energy storage taking place on October 28th. Thank you.